The smell hit me before I even opened the front door. It was 5:47 in the morning. The sky was that deep purple gray you only see in the minutes before Texas dawn decides to show up. My coffee wasn't even brewed. My boots weren't laced. I was still half asleep, running on muscle memory, doing what I'd done every single morning for 11 years on that ranch. Stumbling toward the kitchen, reaching for the coffee can, trying to remember what needed doing before the sun came up. That's when my ranch hand, Danny, started hammering on the back door like the building was actively collapsing. 3 hard knocks. Pause. 3 more. I knew Danny's knock. Danny was not a dramatic man. In 11 years of working together, I had never once seen that man panic. He'd helped me pull a calf out of a muddy ditch at midnight in a rainstorm without raising his voice. He'd been calm the day a fence line went down and we lost 3 hours rounding up cattle in the July heat. Cool, steady, unflappable Danny. So when Danny knocked like that at 5:47 in the morning, I dropped the coffee can on the counter and went straight to the door. He was standing on the back porch with his hat in both hands, turning the brim over and over in his fingers. His face had an expression I'd never seen on him before. Not panic exactly, something closer to disbelief. "Boss," he said, "you need to come out here, right now. You need to see this." My brain started running through the list. Fence line down, water pipe burst, animal got loose, truck wouldn't start, storm damage, normal ranch problems, the kind of stuff that gets you out of bed early but doesn't ruin your life. I was already running the mental checklist as I followed him around the side of the house and started down the long gravel drive toward the front gate. I smelled it before I saw it clearly in the low light. That heavy, wet, sour smell of garbage. Not subtle, not like a bag someone forgot to take out. The kind of smell that hits you in the chest and tells your brain something has gone deeply, fundamentally wrong. I stopped walking. I just stood there in my front driveway at 5:47 in the morning and I stared at what was in front of my gate. Trash bags. Dozens of them. Thick, heavy-duty black garbage bags, stacked 3 and 4 high, stretching the entire width of my entrance gate from one fence post to the other. Some of them had burst open from the weight of the bags stacked on top of them, spilling wet coffee grounds and food waste and soggy cardboard and God knows what else across my gravel drive. The flies were already there. Not a few flies, a cloud, a genuine buzzing, moving cloud of flies at 6 in the morning in the Texas Hill Country, which tells you something about how long that trash had been sitting there in the dark. My gate, the 12-foot custom iron gate I'd had welded 8 years ago, with my family's cattle brand worked right into the metalwork, the gate I drove through every single day of my life on this ranch, was completely buried. Not partially blocked. Buried. You couldn't have walked through there comfortably, let alone driven a truck. I stood completely still. Danny stood next to me with his hat still in his hands, not saying anything because there was nothing to say. We both just looked at it. And then I took a step forward and crouched down next to one of the bags near the edge of the pile. Because I'd noticed something, even in the low morning light, I could see it, written right on the side of the bag in thick black permanent marker. HOA Community Waste. I checked another bag, same label, another one, same label, every single bag marked the same way. She didn't just want to block my gate. She wanted me to know it was her. She wanted me to wake up, walk out, see this mountain of filth in front of my property, and know exactly who had put it there and why. She wanted the humiliation to be personal. I stood back up slowly, rolled my shoulders, took one long breath of that terrible, fly-infested, garbage-soaked morning air. Danny finally spoke. "You want me to call the sheriff?" I didn't answer right away. I was still just looking at the pile. And here's the thing. Here is the thing that Karen Whitfield, HOA president, 6-year tyrant of the Whispering Pines community, blazer-wearing suburban enforcer with a notepad and a god complex, did not know when she ordered those trucks to come out to my ranch in the middle of the night and bury my gate in the community's garbage. She did not know one single critical fact about me. One fact that was about to change everything about how this situation ended. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Because if you woke up one morning and walked outside to find your entire property entrance buried under a mountain of stinking garbage, and you knew exactly who did it and exactly why, what would you do? Because most people would lose it completely. Most. People would be on the phone screaming within 30 seconds. Most people would let the anger take the wheel. I almost did. For about 30 seconds, standing there in that smell with the flies buzzing and the sun just starting to crack the horizon behind me, I almost did. But then something shifted, and I'll tell you exactly what it was and exactly why I started smiling instead. To understand why Karen Whitfield hated me the way she did and why she eventually did something this stupid, you have to understand what this woman was like and what the 18 months leading up to that morning looked like. Because this didn't come out of nowhere. There was a whole history here, a long, slow build of pressure and pushback and escalation that eventually landed us at 5:47 in the morning with 63 bags of garbage in front of my gate. And to understand that, you have to understand the ranch and you have to understand Karen. I've owned my ranch for 11 years. 42 acres in the hill country just south of San Marcos, Texas. I've got a small cattle operation, nothing industrial, just working cattle on a working piece of land. I keep horses. I maintain about 6 acres of hayfields that we cut and bale ourselves. I lease some of the back pasture to a neighboring farmer for his goats, which works out well for both of us. The land has a creek that runs along the northeast corner, a stand of live oaks along the south fence that are probably older than any building in the county, and a view from the back porch at sunset that I genuinely believe I could never find anywhere else in the world. It is, in every sense that matters, home. Not an investment, not a hobby, not a weekend getaway. Home. Nothing about my operation would raise an eyebrow in any county in Texas where ranching is understood as a real activity and not an aesthetic inconvenience. But Whispering Pines was not that kind of community. Whispering Pines was a planned residential subdivision that had been developed on the land directly adjacent to mine, about 7 years after I'd bought my property. 4-bedroom houses on quarter-acre lots, HOA fees, architectural review committees, approved paint color palettes, a community pool with posted hours, and a gazebo near the entrance that I'm fairly sure nobody had ever actually used for anything. The kind of neighborhood where someone had clearly put a lot of thought into what everything looked like, and not quite enough thought into the fact that they were building it next to working agricultural land. When the development went in, the HOA that governed it had zero legal jurisdiction over my property. My deed predated their development by years. My land use was legal, properly permitted, and protected under agricultural zoning statutes that existed long before Whispering Pines was a drawing on an architect's table. My attorney had confirmed all of this. My property lines were clear. My land was my land, and whatever rules Karen Whitfield's HOA chose to impose on the residents who had voluntarily purchased into her community had nothing to do with me. That's the legal reality. Karen's reality was somewhat different. Karen Whitfield had been HOA president for 6 years before I ever moved in full-time. 6 years is a long time to be the unchallenged authority in a small, largely conflict-averse community. 6 years of setting the agenda, writing the notices, interpreting the bylaws, deciding what got addressed and what got ignored. 6 years of being the person everyone in the neighborhood either feared slightly or thanked profusely, and sometimes both at once. That kind of tenure does things to a person's sense of proportion. Before I ever met her, I'd heard about her from neighbors in the area. Not just Whispering Pines residents, people from neighboring properties, people at the feed store, people at the local diner who dealt with the community in various ways. Everyone had a Karen story. There was the retired school teacher who'd lived in Whispering Pines for 12 years. Lived there, paid her dues, never caused a problem, who received a formal written violation notice because she had parked her own car in her own driveway at what Karen had determined was an incorrect angle relative to the curb. The woman had lived in that house for over a decade and had parked her car in that driveway every single day. Incorrect angle, formal notice, $300 fine. There was the young couple who'd bought one of the newer houses and put up holiday lights on their front porch in November. Nice lights, tasteful, white LEDs, and received a cease and desist letter from Karen citing the HOA's exterior decoration policy and describing their lights as, I am quoting directly from something a neighbor showed me once, aesthetically inconsistent with established community standards. They took the lights down. They moved out of the neighborhood within 2 years. There was the man on the corner who had his mailbox post replaced after the original one rotted out. He measured the placement to match the original. Karen had the placement measured by the HOA's contracted landscaping company. It was 2 inches outside the approved zone. He got 3 formal notices in 30 days. I heard all of these stories before I met Karen. I filed them away as interesting local color. I was not worried about any of it because none of it applied to me. I was wrong about how not worried I needed to be. Karen Whitfield had found in the HOA president role exactly the right container for a very particular type of personality. personality. She was organized, genuinely, impressively organized. She was detail-oriented in the way that people are when they believe deeply that details are how civilization either holds together or falls apart. She was relentless in the way that only people who consider their work morally important can be relentless. She was not lazy. She was not sloppy. She was not stupid. She was also completely, profoundly convinced that her authority over the community was not just a contractual arrangement between property owners. It was a calling, a responsibility, a form of stewardship. She did not think she was being petty when she fined the school teacher over parking. She thought she was maintaining standards. She did not think she was being a bully when she drove slowly past houses with her notepad. She thought she was doing the work that had to be done. She genuinely, completely believed in what she was doing. The problem was that believing in your authority very strongly doesn't actually extend that authority to land. It doesn't legally cover. The first time I met Karen was at a neighborhood meeting, about 8 weeks after I'd established full-time residence at the ranch. I went at the suggestion of my neighbor Phil, a good-natured man who ran a small landscaping operation and who had lived adjacent to the Whispering Pines development for years. He told me it would be worth my time to show my face, be friendly, let people see I was a reasonable person. Community relations, he said, cost you an evening, might save you some headaches. I took his advice. I should have taken it with slightly more preparation for what I was walking into. The meeting was held in the community's clubhouse, a clean little building next to the pool, folding chairs set up in rows, a projector screen at the front. About 30 residents, some of whom I recognized from the road. Normal neighborhood meeting energy, people chatting, someone had brought a coffee urn, the usual. Then Karen walked in, navy blazer, July, in Texas. I want you to sit with that for a moment. A navy blazer to a Wednesday evening HOA meeting in July in the Texas Hill Country, where the temperature at 7 in the evening was still nudging 90 degrees. She had a leather portfolio under one arm and her reading glasses perched on top of her head, and the kind of deliberate, purposeful walk that signals to a room that the meeting is not going to start until this person arrives, and the meeting is now, in fact, starting because this person has arrived. She scanned the room immediately. I think it was a habit, checking for faces she didn't know, and she locked onto me within about 4 seconds. I was the only unfamiliar face. She came directly over with the efficiency of someone who has identified a situation that requires immediate management. Her smile arrived before she did. It was a good smile technically, all the right muscles. But it stopped somewhere around the cheekbones and didn't quite make it to her eyes, and there was something in the eyes that was already working, already categorizing, already deciding, already forming a position. "You must be the ranch owner," she said. The words themselves were neutral. The way she said them was not. Ranch owner came out with a particular careful flatness to it. Not hostile, not aggressive, but carrying that precise quality of deliberate neutrality that tells you someone has already made up their mind about the category they're putting you in. Like a doctor saying, "You must be the patient who hasn't been taking his medication," in a perfectly pleasant tone of voice. "Clayton Briggs," I said, and held out my hand. She shook it, told me her name, and from under her arm she produced a printed packet, smooth, pre-prepared, ready to go, and handed it to me with the efficiency of someone who had been planning this handoff for at least a week. 14 pages. Single-spaced, tabbed sections. I did not, standing there in that community room with the coffee urn gurgling behind me, fully appreciate what I was holding. We've taken the liberty of preparing an overview of several areas where your property operations may present some compatibility concerns with community ambiance standards, she said. I hope you'll have time to review it and that we can discuss it at your earliest convenience. Then she moved on to speak to someone else, and I stood there holding my 14 pages, and the meeting started. I took the packet home and read it at my kitchen table that night, all 14 pages. She had formal objections to my exterior lighting schedule. She had formal objections to the hours my ranch hands arrived in the morning. Danny typically came in around 6, and apparently truck tires on gravel at 6 a.m. was a concern. She had formal objections to the visibility of my hay bale storage from the main road during certain months, citing a section of HOA exterior standards policy that I confirmed, upon careful reading, referred specifically to residential structures within the HOA and had no relation to agricultural storage on adjacent non-HOA property. She had formal objections to my roosters, 4 of them, as I've mentioned. Specifically their morning vocalizations, which she had described in the packet as repeated disruptive auditory disturbances beginning before 6 a.m. They're roosters. They crow before 6 a.m. This is definitional, and she had devoted a full page and a half to what she had titled Olfactory Nuisance Potential Arising from Livestock Management Practices in Residential Adjacent Zones, which was a carefully worded way of saying that my cows smelled like cows and my horses smelled like horses, and she found this incompatible with community standards. I read all 14 pages, twice. I made notes in the margins, and then I called my attorney the next morning. He was unsurprised. He confirmed what I already knew. Not a single item in Karen's packet had any legal standing with respect to my property. Her HOA's covenants applied to properties within the HOA. Mine was not within the HOA. Her bylaws governed residents who had agreed to them. I had not agreed to them. My agricultural operations were protected under state and county statutes that predated her community by decades. I owed her absolutely nothing. He drafted a response letter. It was polite, clear, precisely worded, and accompanied by the relevant deed documentation, property survey references, and a brief citation of the applicable agricultural protection statutes. We sent it certified mail with return receipt requested so that there would be a documented record of delivery. Karen's response arrived 12 days later. It was not drafted by her attorney. It was on HOA letterhead in her own apparent voice, and it was significantly less polite than anything my attorney had produced. She questioned our interpretation of the deed language, without citing any specific counter-interpretation. She referenced a county ordinance on agricultural operations near residential zones that, when I pulled it up and read it, did not say what she claimed it said, and in any case applied to new operations seeking permits, not existing permitted operations like mine. And in the second-to-last paragraph, she wrote the line that I think about sometimes when I'm trying to understand what kind of person we're dealing with. She wrote that she expected ongoing dialogue about these concerns, and that she hoped I understood that the community has a long memory when it comes to cooperative neighbors, a long memory. I put the letter in a manila folder. I labeled the folder. I put it in the filing cabinet in my office. That folder would eventually have 17 documents in it before this was over. I started adding to it the very next week. What followed was a sustained, creative, and genuinely relentless campaign of harassment that I have to give Karen some grudging credit for in terms of sheer persistence, even as I describe how completely unhinged it became over 18 months. Because it didn't just happen once or twice. It was a sustained effort, methodical and ongoing, like someone who had decided that wearing you down was a legitimate strategy and was prepared to invest real time in it. It started with the noise complaints. 3 formal written complaints to the county about tractor noise, all filed within a 60-day window. The county called me the first time, a code enforcement officer named Dave, who was professional and thorough. And I walked him through my operating hours, and he confirmed I was well within county noise ordinance and closed the complaint. He called me the second time with a slightly tired tone that suggested he was becoming familiar with the pattern. By the third complaint, Dave called me and, before he even introduced himself, said, "Mr. Briggs, it's Dave from Code Enforcement, and I want you to know I'm legally required to document this complaint and make this call, but I want to save us both some time." He was a good man doing an annoying job caused by someone else's bad faith. I thanked him every time and kept every letter he sent. Then came the fence dispute. which was particularly memorable for how completely it backfired on Karen. She sent me a formal HOA notice on letterhead with a reference number, very official looking, claiming that my south pasture fence line was encroaching approximately 6 inches into a green space easement that ran along the HOA's property boundary. The notice cited a specific section of the HOA's land use policy and indicated that I was required to correct the encroachment within 30 days or face escalation to county enforcement. I had a licensed surveyor out within 2 weeks. His name was Tom Aldridge. Been doing survey work in the county for over 20 years. Solid reputation, didn't make mistakes. Tom surveyed my south pasture fence line thoroughly and carefully. And when he was done and had run his numbers, he called me and told me my fence was positioned 8 feet inside my own property line, not 6 inches over, 8 feet under, 8 feet of clearance between my fence and the property boundary. I sent Karen the survey report, Tom's license number, and a brief letter politely noting that the matter was closed. She sent back a letter, and this is the part that I find genuinely remarkable, questioning whether Tom's survey methodology had properly accounted for a specific county reference benchmark. A specific benchmark, like she'd done research on survey methodology specifically to find something to question. I called Tom, explained the situation, and he was somewhere between amused and offended. He wrote a letter, a detailed, technical, thoroughly professional letter, explaining in precise surveying language exactly why his methodology was correct, why the benchmark she'd cited was irrelevant to a boundary survey of this type, and why the results stood as reported. I forwarded Tom's letter to Karen. She did not respond to that one, which was, honestly, the smart move. Then she elevated to the political level, which is when I realized she was more serious about this than I had initially credited. She started attending county commissioner meetings, regular meetings, public comment periods, showing up with prepared remarks. She wasn't naming me specifically. She was being smarter than that. She was making general arguments about what she called incompatible land use in transitional residential zones and the inadequacy of existing agricultural nuisance standards in communities experiencing rapid residential growth. Carefully worded, policy-oriented, like she'd taken a course in how to lobby without appearing to lobby. I found out about it from Phil, my neighbor, who attended the meetings occasionally for his landscaping business. He called me after the second time she showed up and said, "Clayton, I think that HOA woman is trying to get the county to change the agricultural rules, and I think it's about you." I started attending those meetings too. I spoke during public comment. I brought documentation, printed copies of the county's agricultural protection statutes, data on the economic contributions of working ranches to county tax revenue, information on the specific legal protections that existed for agricultural operations like mine. The commissioners listened politely to both of us. They were, to their credit, not particularly interested in Karen's agenda. One of them, a man who had farmed his own land for 30 years before going into county politics, looked at Karen during one of her presentations with an expression that I can only describe as patiently skeptical. But she kept showing up, meeting after meeting, with that blazer and that portfolio and those prepared remarks, making her case for policy changes that would have given the HOA leverage over operations exactly like mine. The commissioners never acted on any of it. Karen also filed 3 separate formal noise ordinance complaints with county code enforcement in a single month. Not just about the tractor, but about a hay baler I was running, about my diesel generator during a power outage, and about what she described as sustained mechanical operations during early morning hours. All 3 were investigated. All 3 were closed without action. Poor Dave from code enforcement called me after the 3rd one and said, in the most diplomatically worded way possible, that he thought we both knew what was happening and that I should keep documenting everything. I was documenting everything. My folder was getting thick. Then came the situation with my ranch hands, which was the one that genuinely made me angry in a way I had to work to keep controlled. My employees, Danny, Roberto, a part-timer named Kyle, drove their own trucks and my operations work trucks in and out of my property on a normal daily schedule, working ranch schedule. Early starts, sometimes late finishes, trucks on gravel, the normal sounds and movements of a working operation. At some point, Karen had apparently communicated something to the HOA's contracted security patrol, a small private security company that drove through the neighborhood a few times a day, because they started logging the plates of every truck that came in and out of my entrance as suspicious vehicles. I found out about it when Roberto mentioned, very casually, that the patrol car had driven past him 3 times in one afternoon while he was doing fence work near the road. Then Roberto called me one day in a tone that was carefully neutral, but clearly covering something else underneath. He said the security patrol guard had parked next to his truck while he was eating his lunch near the gate and had asked him what he was doing there and whether his vehicle belonged on this road. Roberto had worked for me for 7 years. He was eating lunch near the gate of the property he worked at in a truck that had county commercial vehicle registration clearly visible in the windshield. I called the HOA's management company that afternoon, not Karen directly, the management company that administered the HOA's operations. I asked for the director. I got her on the line and I explained, clearly and without raising my voice, exactly what had happened, the full pattern of it, and exactly what I would be doing next if my employees were approached again by a security patrol that was operating on the basis of Karen's direction. The director was not happy. She apologized. She said she would address it. I told her the address needed to be comprehensive and permanent. I said I had documentation of everything and was prepared to pursue harassment claims if the behavior continued. She addressed it. The patrol stopped logging my trucks, but Karen did not stop. She just shifted. In April of that year, about 3 months before the morning I'm going to get back to, Karen showed up at my front gate with 2 other HOA board members, just drove up and parked outside. Danny saw them pull up and called me on the radio. By the time I walked down from the house, Karen was standing next to her car explaining to Danny that my gate, my 12-foot custom iron gate that had been on that property for 8 years, was creating what she called a sightline obstruction for drivers on the residential corridor and was therefore a public safety concern that needed to be addressed by relocating the gate at my expense. I walked up. She told me the same thing directly, with both board members standing behind her like backup. I told her, calmly and clearly, that my gate had been in that exact position for years before her neighborhood was planned, designed, permitted, or built, that it was entirely on my property, that it created no sightline issues under any county traffic standard I was aware of, and that it was not going anywhere. She held my gaze for a moment. The 2 board members didn't say anything, and then Karen said something that I wrote down word for word in my truck as soon as I got back to it, because I knew I was going to need it. "Property situations can change, Mr. Briggs," she said. "Authority has a way of expanding when people don't cooperate with their neighbors." That was a threat. I believed it was a threat. My attorney, when I called him that evening and read him those exact words, believed it was a threat. He drafted a formal letter that was sent certified mail the next business day, documenting the April gate confrontation in precise detail, noting Karen's statement verbatim, and advising in very plain legal language that any attempt by the HOA, its officers, its agents, or its contractors to take any action with respect to my gate, my entrance, or my property access would result in immediate injunctive proceedings and civil litigation. Karen did not respond to that letter, but something changed after that confrontation. I started noticing that the HOA's garbage trucks, they had a contract with a county waste service company for collection from their common area dumpsters and community waste facilities, were routing past my front gate more than made any logical sense given the location of the HOA's dumpster pads, which were on the opposite side of the development from my entrance. I noticed it twice in the first week after the confrontation, then 3 more times over the following month. A truck rolling slowly past my entrance, going in the direction of the HOA's facility, taking a route that added time and distance with no obvious operational reason. I noticed it. I thought about it for a moment each time. I decided it was probably nothing and went back to whatever I was doing. I should have spent more time on that thought, because 6 weeks after Karen stood at my gate and told me authority had a way of expanding, Danny was knocking on my back door before 6 in the morning, and I was smelling what I was smelling from 20 yards away. I stood at the end of my driveway looking at 63. Bags of HOA-labeled garbage piled against my gate in the thin, early morning light, and for about 30 seconds I didn't move. I just stood there and breathed through the smell and let my brain catch up to what I was seeing. Then I turned to Danny and I said very quietly, "Don't touch a single bag. I want photographs of everything. Every bag, every label, wide shots showing the gate, close shots showing the labels, all of it. Time-stamped. Then call the sheriff's non-emergency line and report illegal dumping on private property." Danny looked at me. "You're not going to call them yourself?" "I need to make a different call first," I said. "Do the photos and the sheriff call. Don't move anything. Don't let anyone else move anything. I'll be back in 15 minutes. I turned and walked back toward the house, and I remember my boots on the gravel sounded very loud in the quiet of that morning. The birds had started up in the live oaks along the south fence. The cattle were moving somewhere in the back pasture. Normal ranch morning sounds, completely incongruous with what was happening at the front of my property. I poured coffee. I sat down at my kitchen table, and then I let myself think about the thing I'd been turning over in my head since the moment I saw those labeled bags in the dark. Karen Whitfield had used the county's waste service company to execute this. The trucks I'd been noticing on the road. The sheriff's illegal dumping report moved through the county system the way those reports do when they have clear documentation and an obvious paper trail. Within 2 business days of the report being filed, county code enforcement had assigned an investigator and initiated a review. The investigator who called me was thorough and systematic. He'd already reviewed the sheriff's photographs, the bag labeling documentation, and the service records that Marcus had submitted. He asked me a series of clear questions, and I answered them with equal clarity. I gave him everything I had. The full 18-month documentation file, the prior complaint records, the April gate confrontation letter, all of it. Context, I explained, was relevant to understanding whether this was an isolated incident or a pattern of deliberate conduct. He agreed that it was relevant. He thanked me for the organized documentation. He told me the investigation would take approximately 2 weeks. It was done in 9 days. The legal picture, as he explained it to me after the investigation concluded, was straightforward. Under Texas solid waste statutes, coordinating with a licensed commercial waste company to dispose of material on private property without the property owner's consent constitutes improper disposal, regardless of whether the party coordinating the disposal holds a legitimate account with the waste company. The HOA's service contract with Lone Star Hall authorized collection from designated HOA sites and disposal at licensed facilities. It could not, under any interpretation, authorize using the service to dump waste at someone else's private property entrance. The labeling on the bags, which Karen had apparently included to make a statement of ownership and intent, served instead as direct evidence of the originating account's involvement. The Code Enforcement Division issued a formal notice of violation to the Whispering Pines HOA. The base civil penalty for commercial vol, the after-hours run, the coordinated dump. She'd done this through the HOA's contracted garbage service. I knew which company handled the HOA's waste. I knew it because it was a company I had looked into when they first started operating in the area, a company I had watched grow, a company I believed in enough to invest in, a company I had been the majority owner of for the past 4 years. Let me back up 8 years because this matters and it's worth understanding clearly. I invested in Lone Star Hall in the early years of its growth. The founder, Gerald Macy, had built the operation from 2 trucks and a lot of determination into a real regional waste management business over about 15 years. Clean operation, solid reputation, good contracts. Gerald was the kind of businessman I respect. Built something from nothing, ran it honestly, knew every detail of how it worked. When he needed capital to expand and pursue larger municipal contracts, someone who knew us both made the introduction. We had lunch. I looked at his books and his contracts and the growth trajectory of waste needs in a rapidly developing county. I invested as a minority partner. Over the years, Gerald worked toward a planned retirement. We'd structured the arrangement from the beginning with a clear transition path. He would gradually reduce his involvement, and I would buy in more deeply over time. It wasn't contentious. It wasn't complicated. It was a clean, agreed-upon transition that both of us understood from day one. 4 years ago, when Gerald was ready to step back fully, I became the majority owner of Lone Star Hall. Marcus Webb runs the day-to-day operations. Marcus came up through the company under Gerald, started as a route supervisor, grew into operations management, knew the business inside out. When Gerald stepped back, Marcus stepped up. He is excellent at the job. I stay at the ownership level, strategy, financials, major decisions. But Marcus runs the trucks, the routes, the contracts, the daily work. My name is not on the Lone Star Hall trucks. My name is not in the company's advertising or on their website or in any listing that a casual search would surface. The ownership is properly documented where it needs to be documented legally, but to the average person in San Marcos, to a homeowner, to a business, to an HOA president who signs a service contract, Lone Star Haul is simply the company that picks up the garbage. It's the trucks, it's the schedule, it's the phone number you call to add a bulk pickup to your account. The Whispering Pines HOA had been a Lone Star Haul account for 3 years. Common area dumpsters, community waste collection, periodic bulk pickup events. Karen Whitfield had used my company, my drivers, my trucks, my account system to dump garbage on my property. The person she'd tried to humiliate with a coordinated garbage dump had been quietly cashing the checks for every garbage pickup her HOA had paid for over the past 3 years. I let that sit for exactly 43 seconds. I counted. Then I called Marcus. He picked up on the second ring, the way he always does. "Marcus," I said, "I need you to pull up the Whispering Pines HOA account and walk me through any service activity on that account in the last 24 hours. I heard the familiar sound of him pulling something up. Active commercial account, San Marcos. Bi-weekly common area service, quarterly bulk, good standing. Typing, a pause. There's a special request on here from yesterday afternoon. After hours run, midnight to 3 a.m. window, logged as a community bulk cleanup event." Another pause, and his voice changed slightly. Not alarmed, just more careful. "The completion notation on this one is a bit vague. Where are you going with this, boss?" I told him. I walked him through exactly what Danny and I had found at the gate. The bags, the labels, the count, the smell, the flies, all of it. I could hear him get very still on the other end of the line while I talked. When I finished, there was a brief silence. "The timing matches our run," he said. "Yes," I said. "Now pull our service contract with that account and read me the improper use and illegal dumping clause." He had it up in 30 seconds. He read it to me. The language was what I expected, what exists in every professional commercial waste agreement, stating clearly that unauthorized or illegal use of contracted services for disposal of material at non-designated sites constitutes a material breach of the contract, triggers immediate suspension of service pending investigation, and may result in permanent contract termination. Lone Star Haul could not allow its services to be used for illegal disposal. Regulatory liability made that a hard line. "There is an active sheriff's report being filed as we speak," I said. "Illegal dumping on private property. The material is clearly labeled HOA community waste on every single bag. 63 bags, Marcus. Every label the same." He was quiet for a moment. "You want me to initiate the suspension and pull together the documentation on the service breach," he said. "I want you to do every single thing exactly as our protocol requires," I said. "Document the breach, initiate the suspension, attach the sheriff's report number when it comes through, and Marcus, I need you to walk me through the procedure for material that's been flagged under an active illegal dumping report and is traceable to an originating account," he told me. Under Lone Star Haul's regulatory compliance procedures that had been developed with legal counsel specifically because solid waste regulations hold companies liable when their services are misused. Material flagged under an active illegal dumping report and clearly traceable to an originating account can be formally designated for return to that account holder pending regulatory investigation. The responsible party holds the material while the matter is resolved. You follow the chain of custody. You document everything. The originating account is liable. Is that procedure current, properly documented? "Yes," Marcus said. "Then follow it. Complete chain of custody documentation on everything, every step photographed and logged. I want a paper trail that would survive any level of scrutiny." "Understood," Marcus said. "I can have a crew to your property within the hour." I hung up, looked at my coffee going cold on the table, and smiled for the first time all morning. Then I called my attorney. By 9 in the morning, the sheriff's deputy had come and gone. He was a professional named Deputy Cortez, who had clearly seen a lot of things in his time with the department. But he was quiet in a particular way when he looked at the labeled bags. That quiet where someone is working to maintain professional neutrality in the face of something that they personally find quite remarkable. He photographed everything methodically. He took my statement carefully. He documented the HOA labeling, noted the count of bags, and opened a case file for illegal dumping on private property under Texas solid waste statutes. Before he left, he handed me the case report number on a small card and told me that code enforcement would likely be in touch within a week. Then he looked at the pile of garbage one more time, looked at me, and said, "That's a pretty bold move on somebody's part." "Yes, it is," I said. He nodded once and got in his vehicle. I wrote the case report number down in 3 separate places. My phone, a notepad in my truck, and a piece of paper I put in the manila folder that now had 18 documents in it. At 10:15, I heard the sound of diesel engines on my road, and 3 Lone Star haul trucks came rolling down toward my gate in a neat line. My trucks, my drivers, working efficiently and professionally on what was, from their perspective, a documented regulatory compliance matter. The crew chief was a man named Dennis, who had been with the company for 6 years. He shook my hand, took one look at the pile, and got his crew started without a lot of commentary. They worked systematically, photographed every bag in position before touching anything, counted them out loud as they loaded, logged each one against the case report number. The whole operation was documented on video and in a written manifest. 63 bags total, every one of them labeled. I watched them work for a while and then walked back to the house. My gravel drive was going to smell for the rest of the day and probably into the next morning, and the flies weren't going anywhere immediately, but my gate was clear. After about 40 minutes, the trucks pulled away in their convoy and the road was quiet again. I went inside. I poured coffee. I sat at my kitchen table and looked out at the pasture and let myself be still for about 20 minutes. At 2:17 that afternoon, Marcus called me. "Delivery completed," he said. "Any issues?" I asked. "Nothing the driver couldn't handle," he said. I could hear something in his voice that he was keeping carefully professional, but it was there. "Good," I said. "Thank you, Marcus." "Anytime, boss," he said. I was not present at the Whispering Pines HOA management office when those 3 trucks arrived that afternoon. I want to be straightforward about that. But I heard the account from 2 separate people over the following day, one of whom had a clear view of the parking lot from a position nearby, and one of whom had been inside the building when it happened, and their accounts were detailed and consistent with each other. The HOA management office was a tidy little brick building on the main access road into the community. Nice landscaping along the foundation, a flagpole with the American flag and the HOA's own little flag below it, a reader board near the entrance that said things like community pool hours and reminder trash bins must be in by 7 p.m. The front of the building had large windows looking directly out over the parking lot, which meant that anyone inside had an unobstructed view of the entire front parking area. Dennis pulled the 3 trucks in at about 2 in the afternoon and positioned them along the front edge of the lot. The crew got out and got to work. They were methodical and professional and completely calm. Bag after bag came off the trucks and was placed, not thrown, not scattered, placed, in the parking lot in organized rows. The bags were stacked the same way they'd been stacked in front of my gate, neatly, professionally. The kind of neat that makes a statement without a word being said. Each bag still had its label, HOA Community Waste, every single one. The crew chief had prepared a formal service notice, printed on Lone Star Hall letterhead, referencing the active sheriff's report number, citing the illegal dumping protocol, and including the account suspension notification, along with the statement that the company's legal team would be following up regarding potential contract termination. This notice was ready to hand over when it was needed. It was needed at approximately 4 minutes into the unloading process. Karen came out of the building fast. She had clearly been watching from those front windows and had realized very quickly what was happening. She came across the parking lot with purpose and volume, telling the crew to stop, telling them to reload everything immediately, telling them they had absolutely no right to do this and that they were making an enormous mistake and that she was going to have all of them fired. Dennis walked over to her calmly. He handed her the service notice. He explained in clear and professional language that Lone Star Hall was executing its documented regulatory compliance procedure for material flagged under an active illegal dumping report, that the material was clearly traceable to her account, and that their legal department would be in contact regarding the account status and the service notice. Karen looked at the notice. She looked at Dennis. She said something. My source wasn't close enough to hear the exact words, but described it as loud and not particularly coherent. Dennis said, respectfully, that he had nothing further to add and walked back to his truck. The 3 trucks pulled out of the parking lot in a line, professional, efficient, done. What they left behind was 63 bags of HOA-labeled community waste, stacked in neat rows in the HOA's own parking lot on a June afternoon in Texas. Karen reportedly stood in the parking lot for a moment after the trucks left, just stood there, looking at the bags. Then the calls started. She called the county. She called Lone Star Hall's main office line. She called the management company that administered the HOA. She reportedly attempted to reach someone at the county commissioner's office. She called, according to the board member who later told me the story, what sounded like approximately 7 different phone numbers in under 2 hours. None of those calls produced the result she was looking for. The bags were still in the parking lot the next morning. UME improper disposal under county ordinance was $4,000. The investigator's report had specifically noted that the action demonstrated premeditation and coordination, evidenced by the after-hours service request, the specific timing, the consistent labeling, and the case was flagged for review at the maximum penalty tier, which carried substantially higher fines and potential for escalated regulatory oversight. The HOA's insurance carrier received notification of the violation from the management company. Standard procedure under their coverage terms when a regulatory enforcement action is filed against the association. The carrier acknowledged receipt and indicated they would be reviewing the circumstances, which, as any HOA board member understands, is not a phrase that comes with good news attached to it. And the waste service suspension held. Lone Star Hall's account for Whispering Pines remained frozen pending resolution of the regulatory matter. Marcus had followed the protocol exactly, and there was nothing for the HOA to dispute on procedural grounds. The protocol was correct, the documentation was complete, and the active investigation made service restoration legally complicated in any case, which meant that the HOA's common area dumpsters stopped being collected. I want to be clear about something here, because I'm aware of how this sounds. I did not want the regular residents of Whispering Pines to suffer. Most of those people had nothing to do with what Karen had done. They were homeowners who paid their dues and used the pool and parked their cars at the approved angle in their driveways and just wanted to live in a nice neighborhood. They didn't deserve to have their garbage piling up. But the service couldn't be restored while the regulatory matter was open, and the regulatory matter was Karen's creation entirely. The connection between her action and the consequence landing on her community was direct and unavoidable. That's not something I engineered. That's just how the chain ran. What I will tell you is this: it was late June in Texas. The daytime temperatures were in the high 90s. The HOA's decorative dumpster enclosures, those nice wooden structures they'd built to make the waste collection areas aesthetically invisible from the walking trail and the pool area, began to fill, and then to overflow, and then to ripen. The community, whose president had formally filed documents describing my cattle's naturally occurring outdoor odor as an olfactory nuisance requiring regulatory action, was, 3 weeks later, generating an olfactory situation that I suspect several of their residents would have described in similar language. Karma, I've found, tends to be literal when given the opportunity. There are things I know about the emergency HOA board meeting because Sandra told me. And there are things I know because word travels in a county like this one, especially when the story involves a sitting HOA president, a garbage company, and a working ranch, all connected in a way that nobody would have predicted. The meeting was called within 10 days of the code enforcement violation notice. I was not invited, obviously, but Sandra reached out through a mutual acquaintance about a week afterward and asked if she could speak with me. We met for coffee at a diner in town and she told me what had happened. She was clearly relieved to tell someone outside the situation, and she was also clearly someone who had been waiting for something to finally break Karen's hold on the board for a long time. The meeting lasted 2 hours and 47 minutes. Sandra had timed it. Karen opened by characterizing the situation as a community maintenance action that had been mischaracterized through a series of administrative misunderstandings. The overnight trash run to my property was, in her framing, an attempt to remove improperly stored material that had been creating a community concern, and the whole situation had been blown out of proportion by my overreaction and by a waste service company that had misapplied its own procedures. The misunderstanding framing did not survive long. One of the board members, a quiet man named Richard, who had been on the board for 3 years, and who Sandra described as someone who rarely spoke but who paid close attention to everything, asked Karen directly whether she had personally authorized the overnight service request to Lone Star Hall. Karen, according to Sandra, did not answer that question directly. She instead began explaining again that the community's interests had required action, that I had been an ongoing challenge to the neighborhood's standards, and that the board needed to stand together on this. Richard waited for her to finish and then asked the same question again. The room got quiet. At some point in the meeting, Sandra wasn't entirely sure how it surfaced, whether someone had researched the company or whether a name had appeared in the Lone Star Hall documentation that someone recognized. The board became aware of the ownership structure of Lone Star Hall. Sandra told me the room went completely silent for about 5 seconds. Then it didn't. The phrase that got repeated in various forms by multiple board members over the following several minutes was essentially a variation of, "Do you understand what you actually did and to whose company you did it with?" It was asked at increasing volumes and with increasing amounts of feeling. Karen, to her credit in a narrow sense, held her position. She continued to argue that her intent had been to protect the community and that the board should support her in defending against what she called an overreaction. The board, collectively, was not in a supportive mood. The practical reality was stark. Karen had exposed the HOA to a minimum $4,000 fine with escalation risk, had created a potential insurance coverage complication, had caused their waste service to be suspended in the middle of summer, and had apparently done all of this unilaterally without board authorization and without any understanding of who she was targeting. The board, members who were most exercised, weren't even necessarily sympathetic to me personally. They were HOA board members who had just discovered that their president had committed an act with significant legal and financial consequences for the association without telling them or asking them. Sandra told me the insurance coverage discussion was particularly animated. The management company had already communicated that the carrier's review was underway. Nobody at that table was happy about the phrase carrier's review. A formal motion for a vote of no confidence in Karen Whitfield's leadership of the HOA was introduced 8 days after the emergency meeting. The vote was publicly noticed, conducted according to the HOA's bylaws, and scheduled for the following week. It passed, 4-1. Karen cast her own vote against the motion. I respect that in a strange way. When your position is that you're right and everyone else is wrong, at least have the conviction to vote it. She was formally removed from the HOA presidency 18 months, 17 days, and approximately 42 complaints after she had handed me a 14-page packet in a community clubhouse and smiled at me with 40% of her face. The HOA's legal counsel reached out to my attorney approximately 3 weeks after the code enforcement violation notice had been issued, by which point Karen had been removed from the presidency and Sandra had been elected to fill the position on an interim basis. I'm going to be deliberately vague about the specific financial terms because some of the settlement was documented as confidential, and frankly, the numbers aren't the most interesting part of the story anyway. What matters is the shape of what was resolved and how it was resolved. The HOA formally acknowledged in writing, in a signed document that is part of the regulatory record, that the disposal of waste material at my property entrance on the morning in question had been unauthorized, improper, and in violation of applicable Texas solid waste statutes. Not a miscommunication, not an administrative misunderstanding. Unauthorized, improper, and in violation of the law. That language was not negotiable on my side, and my attorney was clear about that from the first conversation. The code enforcement fine was paid, not appealed, not disputed through the regulatory process, not challenged, paid. The payment became part of the county's enforcement record. Every piece of prior HOA correspondence that had made claims, assertions, demands, or implications about my ranch's operations was formally withdrawn. The noise complaints, the fence encroachment claim, the olfactory nuisance documentation, the requests to relocate my gate, all of it, formally withdrawn, declared to have no legal standing and no ongoing effect. My attorney told me that paragraph was among the most satisfying he had drafted in recent memory, and he has drafted a lot of paragraphs. The settlement included a financial component. It covered my legal costs from the 18 months of harassment documentation, the immediate response costs from the morning of the dump, and an additional amount that my attorney described as reflective of the nature and deliberateness of what had occurred. I'll leave it at that. Lone Star Hall restored waste service to Whispering Pines approximately 3 weeks after the regulatory matter was formally closed. Marcus handled the restoration smoothly and professionally, as he handles everything. There was no drama about it. The trucks went back on schedule. The dumpsters got collected. Sandra sent me a handwritten note on plain paper, not HOA letterhead, just plain note paper, when she officially took over the presidency. She apologized for the extended situation. She expressed genuine regret that things had reached the point they had. She said she hoped the community and I could simply be neighbors going forward without drama or conflict. I wrote back and told her I had no interest in conflict with anyone, that I had never had any interest in conflict with anyone, and that I looked forward to things being exactly as unremarkable as they should have been from the beginning. That has been exactly what they've been, completely unremarkable. My gate has been clear every morning. Danny arrives at 6 without incident. My roosters crow when they feel like crowing. My cattle smell like cattle. Nobody has filed a noise complaint in a long time. It is exactly what a working ranch next to a residential neighborhood should be. Separate, peaceful, coexisting without drama. Just like it would have been from day one if Karen Whitfield had read the deed documents my attorney sent her and decided that 42 acres of working agricultural land was simply not her jurisdiction. I think about that morning sometimes when I'm making my first drive of the day down to the gate. The way the light comes across the pasture just after sunrise. That particular gold and purple color that only happens in the first 10 minutes before the sun fully clears the tree line. The cattle moving slowly in the backfield. The smell of hay and dew and the particular clean smell that a ranch has in the early morning before the heat sets in and everything becomes something different. The quiet that isn't really quiet at all. Birds in the live oaks. The horses moving in their paddock. Danny's truck coming down the road. But that feels like quiet because it's exactly the sounds that are supposed to be there. I don't think about that morning with anger anymore. I'm not sure I ever really did, not in the way that lingers and corrodes. What I felt in those early hours, standing in that smell with the flies and the labeled bags and the absolute audacity of what someone had decided to do to my property in the middle of the night, was something that started as anger and fairly quickly became something else. Clarity, I called it earlier. I think that's right. The feeling when a situation that has been complicated and dragged out and frustrating for a long time suddenly snaps into focus and becomes very simple when you see exactly what it is and exactly what it requires. Karen had spent 18 months trying to apply pressure from every available angle. Noise complaints, fence disputes, regulatory interference, political lobbying at county meetings, threats about expanding authority, harassment of my employees. She had tried every lever that was available to her, and none of them had moved me, because none of them had any actual legal basis, and I had documented everything and pushed back on everything from the beginning. When none of it worked, she escalated to something direct, something physical, something that was supposed to be impossible to push back on and impossible to ignore. She wanted to make a statement that couldn't be answered with a legal letter or a certified mail response. She just didn't think clearly about who was going to receive the statement, and she certainly didn't think clearly enough about who owned the delivery mechanism. Here is the thing I keep coming back to. Karen wasn't stupid. She was organized. She was persistent. She was strategic in her own way. The mistake she made was not a mistake of intelligence. It was a mistake of assumptions. She had a complete picture of who she thought I was. A rancher, stubborn about his property, with a lawyer and a documentation habit. And she built her entire plan around that picture. She never questioned whether the picture was complete. She never considered what else might be true about me that wasn't visible from the outside. That gap between what she assumed and what was actually true was where her entire plan fell apart. Every conflict has that gap in it somewhere. The thing you don't know about the person you're fighting. The resource they have that you haven't accounted for. The card they're holding that doesn't look like a card from where you're standing. Karen spent 18 months cataloging everything she knew about my operation and thinking about how to use it against me, but she never once thought to ask what she didn't know. She thought she could bury me in trash. Turns out she just delivered it to the wrong address. So that's how the HOA president tried to block my ranch gate with a mountain of garbage, ended up getting fined by county code enforcement, lost her waste service in the middle of a Texas summer, and got removed from her own presidency, all because she decided to go a step too far with the guy who happened to own the garbage company. Turns out using someone's own company to dump trash on their property is a terrible plan under most circumstances, but it reaches a genuinely special level of terrible when that someone has the ability to decide exactly where that trash ends up next. If you enjoyed this story, please hit that like button. It genuinely matters for this channel more than most people realize, and it takes you about half a second. And if you want more stories like this, make sure you're subscribed, because HOA overreach and people who badly misjudge who they're picking a fight with are two things this world has no shortage of, and I intend to keep telling these stories for a long time. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever dealt with an HOA president on a power trip? A neighbor who decided the whole street was their personal jurisdiction? Someone who pushed and then found out they'd pushed exactly the wrong person? If you have a story like that, and I know a lot of you do, drop it in the comments below. I read every single comment. Some of the best stories I've ever come across have come from right there in the comment section, and more than a few of them have ended up becoming videos. I'll see you in the next one.